Okay, so let's continue with our GitHub series. And in that series, we are covering the GitHub actions. So, and today we are going to see the events that trigger the workflow. But let's see what we have covered in the previous video. So in the previous video, we see how we can avoid duplication of the some code. So as an example, in many of the video, I have to in many of the workflow, I have to run the unit test. So one option is as an example. So I have the unit test. So what I'm doing is I'm just doing some copy and paste in all the files in all the files. So this is just the duplication of the code, right? So to avoid the duplication, so what I did is I just create a common workflow, right? So created a common workflow, and that workflow has the unit test. And but this common workflow will not going to be called automatically. Will we have to call it. So on workflow call, I use the event as on workflow call, and I have used wherever I want to use. So as an example, so I have one workflow where I want to run some test, but I know this test or this function is already written in somewhere else. So why can't I just invoke the function from there? So it is kind of like in our coding language, we are invoking the function, right? So it's just an invoking of the function here or invoking of the template. So we use that. So it's about some duplication of the code. All right. So we see that. So so there are like events that trigger the workflow. So till now what we have seen is we have seen one event. So this like own thing is first called as an event, because when this workflow is going to be triggered, workflow dispatch means we are manually triggering the workflow, right? So we already covered a workflow dispatch. We also covered workflow call. But are these only two events? No, there are so many events. So if you come to this like GitHub documentation, you could see on the right hand side there are so many, like branch protection rule, check run, fork, like pull request, push request, push, release, workflow call. So there are so many. So till now we only have covered workflow dispatch. Workflow dispatch, because in all the videos we are seeing workflow dispatch. Workflow dispatch means we are manually triggering to enable the workflow to be triggered manually. So we are seeing that. Then in one of the video we see workflow call. On workflow call, workflow is used to indicate the workflow can be called by the another workflow, right? So as an example, we have seen that this workflow call. So this workflow is called by some other workflow. So that's why we have the workflow call. So now we will look about the workflow run. And so there are so many, but we are going to cover a few which are going to used very widely. So workflow dispatch we already covered, workflow call we already covered. So now we have to see workflow run, and in the coming video we will see schedule, push, pull request. So what is workflow run? So workflow run is, so sometimes what we did is we created two workflow. So let's create that. So let me create a one workflow 10. Let's suppose this is the testing workflow, which is doing some testing. It should be .yaml file. I forgot to do that. Okay, so testing workflow. Let's give the name. Name is the testing workflow. Okay, and we can give the run name as well, and we can give the event name as well. Just copy pasting these things. All right. So this is the testing workflow, which is going to trigger some test, and it runs on Ubuntu latest. So even we don't need to do that, because what we are going to do is we are going to use that use the existing test which we already covered in the previous video. So I'm just copy pasting the things. All right. So we have done that. So this workflow is created. So let me like trigger this workflow first. And before that, yeah, that's fine. Creating testing workflow. So go to the GitHub actions. Go to the actions tab. So we could see our testing workflow and it is set as workflow dispatch. So let's trigger it. So our workflow has been triggered and it has two job because it is using uh, some other template, right? So which has unit test and the second job. But what I want is as soon as this workflow get completed, some other workflow get triggered. Some other workflow get triggered. So how we can do that? How we can do that? So let's suppose I want once the testing workflow get completed, there is another workflow deploy. So when testing get completed, this this workflow should trigger deploy workflow. So this workflow should be triggered. So when this is going to be triggered on workflow run. So if you come here, so on workflow run and when this is going to be triggered. So on workflow run, but when the 1 second, there should be colon. After which workflow? This workflow. So what is the name of this workflow? So copy paste this, the name of that workflow. So testing workflow. So basically the file name and the name of the workflow here is same. But if you change the file name, so you don't need to change here because here the name will be the one which we gave inside the workflow template. And then types. So what is the types? Completed. So basically what I'm saying is this workflow, deploy workflow will be triggered. So it is not workflow dispatch. So we can't trigger it manually. So this should be triggered. It should, but when it will going to be triggered? So it is going to be triggered when testing workflow get completed. So when I'm going to run this workflow and as soon as this is going to completed, this is going to be automatically started. We will see that. So this is a deploy job. Let's do checkout repository and some other step. Deploy application. Starting deployment. Deployment completed. Right. So let's see. Added run workflow. Run git push. So let me go here. So now you could see we have two workflow, testing workflow and the deploy workflow. But if you click on the deploy workflow, I can't trigger it manually. All right. So as because if you click on the testing workflow, we can trigger it manually because it is set as workflow dispatch, which means you can trigger it manually. But deploy workflow, I can't trigger it manually. But deploy workflow is set as, so let's open the file. Deploy workflow is set as on workflow run. So how it's going to be run? So it is going to be run when that particular workflow is going to be completed. So let's trigger the testing workflow and see whether deploy workflow will automatically get triggered or not. So testing workflow started. So click on the actions tab. So now I could see testing workflow is running. As soon, so this is in progress. So status is in progress. If you see status is in progress. So there are multiple status. One is in progress, failure, like so completed, so many statuses. So currently the status is in progress. So now it's completed. But after that, what we are expecting is deploy workflow should automatically get started. So deploy workflow is automatically get started. So this is the advantage of the event. What event? Workflow underscore run. So this is also widely used workflow run many times. Generally, it is used in the combination of a test. Right. So we want, because there are so many tests. Right. So generally, what we prefer is, because there are unit tests, there are some functional tests, there are integration tests, so many tests. So what generally we prefer is, okay, let's create a testing workflow different. And as soon as the testing workflow get completed, we want to trigger the deploy workflow. So one option is that, okay, you can create a different job, deploy workflow within the same workflow. But sometimes like we want, okay, let's maintain in a different workflow file. So if you are maintaining in a different workflow file and you want that that file should be triggered when testing get completed, because if testing itself get failed, you don't want to deploy your application, right? So the same thing with what we did is, so we created our testing workflow. So we what we are saying is, let's complete our testing. So once the testing get completed, this workflow should be triggered. So how this, when this workflow to be triggered, when testing workflow gets completed. So there are multiple types here. So if you see here, there is a workflow activity types comes completed. Currently, we are using completed. Most of the time, we use completed. There is the requested. There is a in progress. In progress means as soon as like the workflows get triggered. Okay, and along with that, you can mention multiple workflow here as well. So currently I have mentioned only one workflow. So you want to mention another workflow as well. So maybe it is dependent upon two workflows. All right. But if you mention two workflow, it doesn't mean when both of the workflow get completed, then only it's going to be run. No, when any of the workflow get completed, then this is going to be started. So generally, when you say, okay, if any of the test, like there are two files, one is smoke test, one is the function test. If any of the one get completed, let's start the deployment. Then you can do that. So they have also mentioned you staging and lab. So a workflow will trigger whether the staging workflow or the lab workflow gets completed. So it is not dependent on both. It is dependent on either. So any of the one get completed, this will get completed. So we have covered workflow run, dispatch, workflow dispatch we already covered, workflow call we already covered. So in the coming video, we will see scheduled, because this is also very important, because many times we want to schedule our workflow and pull request, push request. So that is also like important. So deploy workflow also completed and deploy job also completed. And you can see starting deployment complete. So this is just a basic thing, and whatever you want to do, you can do that. So that's it. That's the end of the video. Thank you.